My name is Deborah Brown, and I turned 67 just a few months ago. I never imagined I would be spending the stage of my life as a widow, sitting in a cold church in Boston while the winter wind rattled the stained glass windows. The air smelled of lilies and candle smoke, and every breath felt heavy as I tried to keep my hands from trembling on my lap. Stephen had been my husband for more than 4 decades, and the silence left by his absence felt louder than the organ music filling the space. When the service ended, friends and family offered words that sounded hollow in my ears. I smiled politely, but inside I was crumbling. Later that day, I sat across from the lawyer, a polished wooden table between us. Brian, my only son, adjusted his tie with impatience, his eyes already gleaming with expectation. The attorney cleared his throat and began to read the will. Stephen's voice seemed to echo through each line, but the words struck like sharp stones. To Brian Brown, my son, I leave the Los Angeles penthouse and my primary investment portfolio. To my beloved wife, Deborah Brown, I leave the property located at an industrial address in New Jersey, the garage and its contents. The word garage rattled inside my chest. I felt the room tilt, the polished floor swimming beneath my eyes. Brian's lips curled into a faint smile that he tried to disguise. He leaned toward me and pressed my shoulder with a hand that felt more like a grip than comfort. He whispered low, promising to handle everything, then muttered that the garage was worthless anyway. My throat closed, but I nodded because I had no strength to argue. Later that evening, I returned to what I thought was still my home, the penthouse where Stephen and I had built 15 years of memories. I carried my suitcase inside, only to hear Brian's firm voice telling me that things had changed. He explained that the penthouse was his now, and that he had plans for renovations. He suggested I stay with an aunt, or perhaps use the garage my husband had left me. The casual cruelty in his words cut deeper than the winter wind outside. I begged for time to adjust, asked if I could stay a little longer, but Brian's expression hardened. He said the penthouse was no longer mine, that Stephen had made it clear in the will. I looked at him, searching for the boy I had raised, the boy who once held my hand crossing streets, but all I saw was a man of ambition with no room for his mother. My knees shook as I steadied myself against the back of a chair. He turned away, already on his phone, already moving forward with his new life. Hours later, I found myself driving through unfamiliar streets, my suitcase and purse my only company. The city lights blurred through my tears as I wondered how I had become a guest in my own life. I followed the directions to the address written on a small slip of paper. The neighborhood grew darker, warehouses lining the road. At last I pulled up before a dilapidated building, its metal door rusted paint peeling in streaks. This was my inheritance, my future. Rain began to fall as I stepped out of the car, the cold seeping quickly through my coat. I clutched the key the lawyer had handed me, its edges rough and unfamiliar. My fingers shook so badly I nearly dropped it. With effort, I slid it into the lock. The old door groaned in protest as if warning me away. I took a deep breath, raised my flashlight, and pushed it open. The beam cut through decades of dust, and for a moment I thought I saw nothing but shadows. Then the light struck something metallic and gleaming. I froze, my heart pounding as I realized this garage was not what it seemed. The air inside the garage was warmer than I expected, a dry hum that felt out of place for such a run-down exterior. My flashlight beam slid over smooth flooring, not the cracked concrete I had braced for. The smell of oil and mildew was absent. Instead, there was the faint, sterile scent of climate control, like a museum or laboratory. I stepped farther in my shoes, clicking softly, and my breath caught as the light revealed the curved silver grille of a car that seemed untouched by time. The cover slipped through my trembling fingers as I pulled it away, and the shape beneath took form. An Aston Martin DB5 gleamed back at me, its polished silver catching my light, as if it had been waiting for this moment. I remembered Stephen watching old James Bond, films his quiet smile whenever that same model appeared. My knees felt weak. This was no dusty relic. This was a treasure flawless and alive in its stillness. I staggered to the next shape, my hands shaking as I pulled at the heavy cloth. A Mercedes-Benz 300 SL emerged its gull-wing doors, hinting at flight even while grounded. The deep blue paint shimmered under recessed lighting that I now noticed glowing softly from the ceiling. Stephen had not just parked cars here. He had built a sanctuary. The gleam of chrome and the elegance of design left me breathless, as though I had stepped into another world. The last cover revealed a Ferrari 275 GTB in a rich red that made me think of anniversaries and the wine Stephen loved to order. Its sleek body looked ready to race down a coastal road, though it had been hidden away in silence. Beside each car sat a leather portfolio thick with papers and records. Even with my untrained eyes, I understood these were not simply vehicles. They were investments of staggering value. I turned and for the first time noticed the modern fixtures above me. The garage had been crafted to protect with air circulation, spotless flooring, and lighting that seemed designed for display. This was not an abandoned space. It was a carefully constructed vault. My chest tightened as I imagined Stephen here quietly preparing all of this without a word to me. On the wall near the switch, I saw an envelope with my name written in his familiar hand. I broke the seal, my heart pounding as I unfolded the letter. Stephen explained that he had chosen this path to shield me from Brian's control, that leaving me visible wealth would only give our son power over me. The cars alone were worth nearly $12 million. The documentation and trusted contacts enclosed would help me handle them. He wrote that he wanted me free, not dependent, and that this secret was his final way of protecting me. Tears blurred the words as I pressed the letter to my chest. I thought of the lonely night at the funeral, the cruel dismissal from my son, and the way Stephen had silently carried his foresight while I remained unaware. Standing in the glow of hidden treasures, I realized this was not only about money. It was about love and trust prepared over years, so that when he was gone, I would still stand strong. The garage key had not opened a ruin. It had opened my independence. Inside the garage, safe tucked behind folders of investment records, I found a deed to a cottage in Carmel, California. My breath caught as I read the details. Stephen had purchased it years ago, fully furnished and waiting for me. The idea of a place by the ocean stirred something fragile inside me, a longing for peace that I had almost forgotten. The next morning, I drove west, leaving behind the gray warehouses and cold streets. Highway 1 unfolded before me like a ribbon draped across the cliffs. The Pacific stretched out in endless blue, the sunlight catching on the waves as if the sea itself was welcoming me. I felt the tension in my chest loosen with every mile, each turn of the road carrying me closer to something new. When I arrived, the cottage looked like something from a storybook, hidden behind cypress trees, with a garden spilling color onto a stone path. The Dutch door creaked softly as I stepped inside, and I gasped at what I saw. Warm wood floors, shelves lined with books, and a painting on the wall of the Venice Canal where Stephen had once held my hand. Every corner whispered of his love, his care, his desire to make me feel at home even without him. As I stood in awe, there was a knock on the door. An older woman with kind eyes and a covered dish smiled at me. She introduced herself as Susan the neighbor 2 doors down. She explained that Stephen had asked her to look out for me when I arrived. The casserole in her hands felt like more than food. It was proof that I was not alone. That night, as the waves murmured outside and the cottage embraced me like a safe harbor, I felt the first spark of hope since Stephen's funeral. My phone buzzed on the table. Brian's name lit up the screen. My heart tightened as I answered, knowing that whatever peace I had just begun to find was about to be tested. Brian arrived without warning. On a bright afternoon, his car door slamming hard enough to make the garden birds scatter. I watched him stride up the path with a tight jaw and restless hands. The sun was warm, but a chill moved through the cottage as if the air knew a storm was coming. He did not step inside right away. He stood at the threshold and demanded to know what I was hiding. The word garage hung between us like a dare, and I could hear the same disbelief I had felt on the night of the will. I opened the door and asked him to sit. He ignored the offer and paced the room, eyes darting over the books, the soft rugs, the framed painting of Venice that Stephen had chosen. He said the cottage proved there was more than I had admitted and that I had tricked him. I kept my voice even and told him I had learned everything only after the funeral. I said that I was still learning. The steadiness in my tone seemed to irritate him more than any defense could have. He stepped close and said the garage was not worthless, that he had seen reflections through a dusty pane and the polished curve of something rare. He listed models and prices like a ledger, as if numbers alone could prove his case. His words were fast and sharp, but beneath them I heard panic. I asked how long he had been searching. He said he had hired someone because he feared for me, then stumbled on the truth by accident. I saw a flush rise on his neck as he explained that this was about safety, not money, and the lie fell flat between us. I told him Stephen wanted me safe and wanted him tested. He snapped back that Stephen never believed in him, that every achievement had been met with a raised eyebrow instead of praise. The confession startled us both, and for the first time he was not a man with a plan, but a son with an old bruise. Silence settled for a moment. I felt sympathy and grief move through me like a slow wave, but I did not step away from my ground. I said that hurt did not excuse cruelty, and that love could not survive without respect. He demanded access. He said we were family and that family shared assets. He reminded me of birthdays and holidays and the long years that linked us. Then he asked for keys, papers, anything to prove I trusted him. I shook my head and set the table with facts. The collection was real. The stewardship was mine. Any help for him would come with conditions that protected both of us from old patterns that had already caused harm. He laughed without humor and asked if I was putting him on an allowance like a child. I said this was not punishment. This was structure. I explained what help would look like. Full transparency of every account and debt. Independent financial oversight that neither of us controlled. A plan that paid creditors in an order set by professionals rather than emotion. I added one more requirement. He would meet with a counselor to face the fear that drove him to grasp and bully. He would also apologize for the night he turned me out of my home and for the way he spoke to me. The words tasted like steel in my mouth, but they felt right. He flung a hand toward the door and said he would see me in court. I nodded and said that was his choice, but that lawsuits would not change Stephen's intent or the legal strength of the trusts. I told him I would rather spend my time building a future than fighting a past. He stopped pacing and stared at the photo on the shelf of Stephen and Brian at a ball game. His shoulders dropped an inch, then squared again as if he had caught himself slipping. He muttered that he did not need therapy and that apologies were cheap. Then he reached for his keys. I followed him to the porch, where the light softened through the cypress. He did not meet my eyes as he said that I had turned his father against him by keeping secrets. I told him the secret had not been mine, and that Stephen had acted to protect us both. For a heartbeat, I saw something raw in his face. It was not greed. It was a frightened little boy who had learned to barter love with achievements and who could not figure out why the math no longer worked. The flicker passed when he noticed me seeing him. He climbed into the car and called out that the next conversation would be with lawyers. The engine revved loud and strained, and he sped away as gravel popped under the tires. I stood in the quiet that followed and let my hands shake. Inside, the cottage felt steady again. I made tea and watched the steam rise while the ocean sighed in the distance. I thought about my son and the old story he had carried for years, a story where worth was always on trial and affection had to be earned. I did not excuse what he had done. I did not bend the conditions I had set. I let myself feel the ache, and then I placed the feelings where they belonged. Love with a boundary is still love, and sometimes it is the only kind that can survive. Before dusk, Susan tapped on the door to check in. I told her I was fine and that the day had been hard but necessary. She squeezed my hand with a quiet strength that reminded me I was not alone. Later, I walked the garden path and listened to the sea. The air smelled of rosemary and salt, and the first stars appeared like patient witnesses. I knew this was not the end of the conflict, but I also knew something had shifted. I had spoken from a place that did not beg for approval. I had chosen dignity, and the ground beneath my feet felt solid. When the call came, I already knew what it would be about. Brian's voice was tight-clipped with desperation as he asked me to meet him at the penthouse. I drove into Los Angeles with a heavy heart, the city streets reflecting late afternoon light against glass towers that felt cold and impersonal. The doorman, who had once greeted Stephen and me with warmth, looked at me with quiet sympathy as he let me in. I stepped into the penthouse and nearly gasped. The marble floors were torn up, wires hung loose from ceilings, and dust coated every corner. It was a hollow shell, stripped of warmth and life, a monument to ambition that had collapsed under its own weight. Brian stood in the middle of the chaos. His expensive suit wrinkled, his shoulders slumped. He admitted the renovations had spiraled out of control, the loans piled high, and the investments he had counted on had failed. His voice cracked when he said he could not keep up with payments, and that foreclosure was weeks away. I looked around at the destruction and told him the penthouse was a mirror of his choices. He bristled, but then dropped his gaze. For the first time, I saw him without armor. He said the real wound was not money, but the feeling that his father had never trusted him. Every business deal, every show of success had been his way of trying to earn respect he never believed he had. I listened, sadness pressing on my chest. Then I told him trust could not be built on entitlement. I said I would help, but only with conditions. Complete transparency of his finances, oversight from independent advisors, commitment to therapy to face the root of his behavior, and most of all, an apology. He resisted at first, his pride flaring, but exhaustion softened him. He said he was sorry for calling me useless and for turning me out of my home. The words were halting, but they carried weight. I accepted the apology not as a erasure of pain, but as a first stone laid on a new path. Weeks turned into months as I watched him struggle with accountability. The trust managed his debts. Therapy sessions challenged his patterns. Slowly, his sharp edges dulled, and he began to look less like the angry man who had stormed my cottage and more like the son I remembered. One afternoon, he came to Carmel carrying a small box. His hands shook slightly as he set it before me. Inside was a gold band worn smooth with years, Stephen's anniversary ring thought lost in the chaos of the penthouse. Brian said he had found it in a drawer and knew it belonged with me. His voice caught as he added that he wanted me to have a piece of what his father had intended all along. I slid the ring onto my finger beside my wedding band, the plain gold and the jeweled circle resting together. Tears filled my eyes, but they were gentler this time. I thanked him, and for once, he did not deflect. He simply nodded a quiet acknowledgement that change had begun. That evening, I took the Aston Martin from the garage and drove along the California coast. The engine purred beneath me, steady and strong, while the ocean stretched wide in the fading sun. The rings on my hand caught the light, one from the beginning of my marriage, the other from a promise fulfilled even after loss. As the wind brushed my face, I thought about how a rusty garage key had opened far more than a door. It had unlocked freedom, dignity, and the chance to heal across generations. Mercy had found its place not in surrender, but in setting conditions that gave both of us a way forward. I steered the car into the horizon, ready for whatever came next, carrying both the weight and the gift of Stephen's final act of love.